𝗪𝗏 الحمد لله رب العالمين الصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين وبعد رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي ثم أما بعد. Jazakallah khair for coming and attending the Family Night series. Inshallah, this will be a two-part session. The first part is meant to be fundamentals that are necessary in order to establish a righteous family. A righteous, basically a foundation of the family unit. And then the second part, which will be in about 2 weeks' time, is going to be more so about the next step after that, which is the continuation, which is how do you basically continue from one generation to another? How do you ensure that your progeny is upon not just the level of guidance that you have, but they surpass you in guidance as well as in contribution to the ummah. So these are the two sessions that we'll cover, inshallah. So inshallah, we'll begin with the background and the introduction to marriage and to family itself as an institution within Islam. What place does it have in the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? The ayah in Surah Al-Rum is a very comprehensive and a very important ayah when it comes to this particular topic, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ أَنْ خَلَقَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِقَوْمٍ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that from among His signs, and something that is a sign or something that is called a sign is meant to draw our attention, our focus, because it's something grand. It's a sign that points us back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in some way, shape or form. In this case, it will be the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That from among His signs is that He created from among you your spouses. Why? The reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions is that so there can be something called sakina, لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا. What is sakina? Sakina or sakana, sukun, is something that is the opposite of movement. Just like, for example, in the Arabic language, we have harakat. We have the fatha, kasra, dhamma, which indicates the movement of the sound when a particular letter is recited. And then you have sukun, which is the absence of any kind of movement. The meaning here, within the context of the family and within marriage, is that sakina is that quality of stability. That there's a lack of any kind of movement and change that is harmful to the health and the wellness of the individuals who are involved here, both the husband, the wife, and the children to come, and the progeny to come after that as a legacy. We need, as a fundamental aspect of our humanity, we need, from among our many needs, is to have a level of assurance that when we go home, that we'll have our basic necessities, whether it's food or water or shelter, or whether it's companionship, etc. All of that is basically met. This is the very purpose of marriage and of families. Look at, for example, how devastating the challenge is for those who are displaced. And we have plenty of examples in the ummah, unfortunately, today. When you look at, for example, the elders in Gaza who are being displaced, the children who have to literally pack their bags on their back and travel from one place to another on foot. This is a devastating impact that comes with it. And this is why the level of oppression that is happening, that displaces individuals like this and families like that, is something that needs to be combated and opposed. This is exactly the opposite of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intends when it comes to the institution of the family. Another aspect of marriage and family is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to protect our position in His eyes. And the way that it does that is by protecting our private parts. And that is the real objective of marriage. The most fundamental objective of marriage is not necessarily companionship or procreation or children. All of those are secondary. They're important, but they're secondary. The first and the primary motive of marriage is the protection of the private parts. Because that is what protects not just our standing with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but it also protects the lineage that comes out after us. One of the biggest calamities that we're facing in the world today is among the young children an existential crisis. Why? Because many of them don't even know who their fathers are. Many of them, even if they know, they are being born in families where basically you have a single mother setup. And this is devastating. Every single statistic that exists on the development of children and the impact and the contributions that they have in society is something that is considered to be negative when they come from that kind of a situation where the family unit is broken. As such, this is the reason why the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam in a hadith that was narrated by Imam 𝗪𝗏𝗿𝗲, he says, سلامة الرجل في الفتنة أن يلزم بيته. That in times of trials and tribulations, the most safe and peaceful environment that exists for a person is their house, is to stay within their house. And this is the reason why the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala heavily emphasizes the facilitation of marriage itself. The facilitation of establishing families as early as possible. But now I said early, but what do you guys think in terms of what is the ideal age where the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala emphasizes marriage? What do you guys think? Yes?
16 to 18.
16 to 18. Yeah. Okay, why do you say that? It's very specific.
Well, technically, that's when puberty hits and one basically matures and becomes from a boy to a man.
The puberty comes a little bit earlier than that.
That's a little bit earlier, but it's like usually that time it's like a person managed to accumulate wealth and managed to get a marriage.
Okay, that's one point. Jazakallah khair. Any other points? What is the ideal age that is being emphasized in the deen? Or is there one? Yes.
I don't think it's an age. I think it's when certain factors are met, like maturity and ability to get married, and ability includes several things.
Such as?
Could partly be financial, could partly be just maturity yourself, and other things that you'll help us with.
Okay, Jazakallah khair. So the brother mentioned that there's no specific age, but there are qualities that once they're there, then it is recommended for them to get married. What about, is there anybody else who wants to contribute? Anybody from the sister side? So, Abdurrahman, what you said is correct. There's no specific age that is given. Rather, there is an emphasis of balance between the communities being obligated and the families being obligated to facilitate marriage, but at the age at which basically they're ready for marriage. Financially, emotionally, physically, psychologically, etc., to take on the responsibility that comes. What is the ayah that basically obligates the facilitation of marriage? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَأَنْكِحُوا الْأَيَامَ مِنْكُمْ وَالصَّالِحِينَ مِنْ عِبَادِكُمْ وَإِمَائِكُمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands here in this ayah, in Surah An-Nur, to facilitate marriage. Let those who are single among you and the righteous among those who are from the male and the female slaves, the right hand possessions, let them get married. And it comes in the form of a command. But rather, in another ayah in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, وَابْتَلُوا الْيَتَامَ حَتَّى إِذَا بَلَغُوا النِّكَاحِ. In the context of taking care of the orphans, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that we should test the orphans in terms of their abilities until they reach حَتَّى إِذَا بَلَغُوا النِّكَاحِ, until they reach the age of nikah. The age of nikah is not mentioned in terms of a number. Rather, it is important for those who are in charge of children, whether they're orphans or not, to test their abilities to see if they're ready to take on the responsibility of marriage. Now, what are some of the problems that we're facing today in society when it comes to establishing families? We have, on the one hand, we have families and communities that are shifting their standards away from what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has legislated. When we look at, for example, even the practices at weddings, the ceremonies at the weddings, or even after marriage, we have difficult propositions that are being made, propositions that are not within the deen. Like, for example, the 50-50 splitting of bills. Or you have very weird setups that are also seen in other homes as well, where the man and the woman agrees that she is going to be the breadwinner and he is going to be the stay-at-home husband and father. These kind of funky setups exist within the Muslims as well. This is a fundamental shift away from the standards of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because all of that is going to come back to the individual and the family. When the real fitrah, the real psychological and emotional nature that we have, upon which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded all of the rights and responsibilities and the natures of the husband and the wife and the children and the parents, all of that is based upon our fitrah. So when we move away from that, it leads to nothing but chaos. Then we also have a lack of long-term focus as well. We see a lot of young individuals who are getting into, or at least intending marriage, but they don't have a long-term focus. A man, for example, all he's thinking about is how can he basically fulfill his physical needs, and rightfully so, that is a huge need. But they're not thinking beyond that. Or a woman, for example, who just daydreams about the wedding day and how the marriage is going to be, or the wedding is going to be, but after that, what is the marriage and the marital setup, and getting along with her husband and raising children, upon which method, upon which standard, all of that is missing as a long-term focus. So this is a big issue as well that we're going to address. Then you also have a fundamental lack of focus on people developing themselves prior to marriage as well. And this is something that is absolutely essential to look at. We spend about 16 years from grade 1 all the way till the end of a normal 4-year bachelor's degree. We have spent 16 years of education when it comes to starting a basic career, a basic job. But we think that when we spend, let's say, enough time for one counseling session or another, we read one book or another, we go to one halaqah or another, and that's enough for us to be ready for marriage, to be ready to basically face the challenges that come with raising children in this kind of an environment. This is not fair. This is not fair upon yourself, this is not fair upon your spouse, and this is not fair upon your children. There has to be a level of adequate and balanced investment that we have to make in our families. There's a level of tarbiyah that has to be done so that we can avoid the challenges that come and that we're going to inevitably face. Right, so let us focus now on a few qualities that are essential for us to develop and emphasize in order to have longevity, in order to have a successful family, a successful marriage, a successful foundation upon which a righteous future generation can come out of it. By the way, this is an absolutely essential need that we have. This is the time to think about the next generation, not afterwards, not after they're already in their 20s and 30s and they're struggling. No, the care and the concern of the next generation starts well before even they're conceived in the wombs of their parents today. And especially when you look at the world today, the challenges that we face in the ummah, the weakening of the ummah, the fact that it's being taken advantage of in every single nation out there, it becomes even more imperative that we focus our energy so that we can build individuals who have strength. They have strength of character. They have a strong identity that they can go and defend. That they're not easily swayed by a single YouTube video or a clip on TikTok that kind of takes them out to the fold of Islam because atheist so-and-so or a Christian so-and-so says this or that. This is something we cannot afford anymore. We need people who have a sound and deep understanding to be able to identify truth from falsehood, and then have the ability to transfer that knowledge to the generation that comes afterwards. This is what separated the Sahaba from those who came afterwards. When you look at the generation that came after the Sahaba, the Tabi'een were the generation of scholars. They were the generations that basically conquered the Romans and the Persians, and the lands after that as well. Why? Because they were built, they were taught, they were given the tarbiyah by the Sahaba, the ones who were given tarbiyah by the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is what we need to replicate in this day and age. So how do we do that? The first way that we will achieve that, inshallah, is by developing a healthy spiritual, intellectual, and mental health foundation prior to marriage. And that is basically as part of our own growth process as well. This is prior to marriage. You can't basically go and fix these things once you're in the middle of it. It becomes much more difficult to do that. You have to have a focus, like we mentioned. We spend all of these years developing for our career. We need to do the same thing when it comes to our families and our marriage. And all of these things that I just mentioned, the spirituality, the intellect, the mental resources, the psychological state, all of those are connected together. Now, how do we basically do that? Or why is that important even before that? In the ayah that I mentioned in the beginning, Surah Al-Rum, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions a very crucial aspect, and that is وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that He is the one who placed between you affection, love, and rahmah, mercy. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one taking responsibility for placing these two things between us and our spouse. If something is coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it necessitates that we seek it from Him. It's not going to come from anywhere else. If anybody thinks that the amount of love in their marriage is going to come because we basically did our action only, like for example, a lot of women, they desire love, but they will turn it into a transactional activity, that they're basically going and taking care of their children, they're cooking and cleaning and so on and so forth in exchange for that love, as a transaction between her and her husband. This is exactly what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us not to do. Allah is the one who's basically placing between you affection and mercy. Meaning we need to do the same exact things that we just mentioned, meaning fulfilling our responsibilities. But they must be done sincerely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They must be done with the right intention, and they must be done in accordance with the commands that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned. And only then Allah will bestow this between you. It is already reorienting and refocusing our energy to who? Not to necessarily the creation of Allah. No, that is basically deserving of only our means. But the real intent, the real source of goodness is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that basically can be summarized. How do we achieve that, by the way? How do we achieve this particular quality of turning back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? There's in one word we can summarize all of this that we'll discuss. When we channel and focus all of our energy towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yes, we're fulfilling the rights of those who are around us. That is part of basically being sincere to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But all of this that we just mentioned, where the heart only has the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in it, and the actions are being done in accordance with His commands, only for His pleasure, what is all of that summarized into a single word? I'm looking for that one word. Taqwa is, yes, that's a good word. Tawakkul. All of these, okay, any other suggestions? Great, alhamdulillah. So mindfulness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What else? Aqidah. So that is closer, because what you mentioned about the mindfulness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, tawakkul as well as what I heard, all of that goes back, is basically the fruit, is connected to the root of a very fundamental concept. And that is Tawheed itself. All of that basically goes back to this concept of Tawheed. What is Tawheed? Who can define in a very simple way Tawheed?
The oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
The oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In what aspect? Okay. Anybody else wants to add to that? Yes. Beautiful. Okay, so he's basically recognizing that he's the sole creator and the sole owner, basically, of everything. Okay, beautiful. Anybody else wants to add to that? Okay, beautiful. Anybody from the sister side? Tawheed? طيب, so this basically, we can summarize all of that. All of what was mentioned is correct. Tawheed is to single out Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in three elements. The first is the rububiyyah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Rububiyyah means the lordship of Allah. To recognize and single out the fact that the brother mentioned that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is our Rabb. He is the one basically who is the fundamental creator, and everything else is dependent as a creation to the creator. That's the rububiyyah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the second aspect is to single out Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in uluhiyyah. Uluhiyyah is in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That we basically make the worship of Allah our priority. Everything basically goes back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a priority that we have. So the first aspect is the actions of Allah. The fact that He's our Rabb. And that's the first. And the second, the uluhiyyah, is our actions. Our worship towards Him. Our sincerity towards Him. Our intention of purity towards Him. And then we have the third aspect, which is singling out Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in al-asma wa sifat, the names and the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So to recognize, for example, that Allah is al-khaliq, He's the one who is the fundamental creator. He's the maximally perfect creator. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-adl, He's the most just, meaning His laws and His commands lead to the ultimate justice. Not anybody else's subjective laws will lead to justice the same way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who's external to any human being. Anybody who basically goes and lives in a system where a man or a woman has created a standard or a law, it will always have that level of bias. It will always basically push them to benefit themselves over other individuals. Whereas Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is external to that. He's al-adl, He's the most just. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the one who's ar-Rahman, the most merciful. He's al-Latif, He's the most gentle. Because He knows He's the one who created. And the creator is the one who's basically the most gentle towards their creation. Because they have the most intimate understanding of that particular being. So it is basically now Tawheed, which is the foundation of everything that is good. Everything that leads to victory is basically summarized in this word of Tawheed. Even, for example, its connection towards the month that we're in right now. Which month are we in right now, Islamically? Muharram. We're in Muharram. And what is Muharram known for in terms of its day? That is a secondary aspect. What is it from the Sunnah of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam? What is the significance of that one specific day in the month of Muharram? The day of Ashura. What happened in the day of Ashura? Bani Israel was saved from what? From Fir'aun. This is the day in which we basically celebrate the connection between Tawheed and the victory and the saving of the believers, the success of the believers. Of course. I mean, I don't have the exact direct references with me, but this is exactly what the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned when he went to Medina and he saw the people, the Yahud of Medina fasting on the day of Ashura. And when he inquired, why are you fasting? This is what they mentioned, because this was the day Musa alayhi salam was saved and the believers were saved. Because of the expression of their Tawheed. The point I'm trying to make here is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made an example, a connection between Tawheed and success. And the opposite of that is also true. When we look at the same Bani Israel, after they were saved from Fir'aun in Egypt, they were told that you have a very specific land that is promised to you. All you have to do is go over there and you'll have that land so that you can worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in peace. What did they do when they were on their way to that particular land? With Musa alayhi salam. Here's the righteous leader, the righteous imam appointed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you have an ummah of 600,000 roughly, who are basically being transferred to that particular land. What did they do when they basically reached that particular land? Who knows?
Worship the cow.
They worshipped the calf. So they basically went against the tawheed of Allah. So that's one aspect as well. What else did they do?
They were ungrateful.
They were ungrateful as well. Why?
That was supplied by Allah Ta'ala when they had no food.
Okay, so they were ungrateful as well. Correct. What else did they do? Especially when they reached that particular land that was promised to them. Who remembers that? They were commanded to go and enter that particular land, but then their response was, you and your Lord, Musa alayhi salam, you and your Lord go fight. We're going to stay right here and do nothing. So they fundamentally disobeyed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They negated their tawheed by worshipping the calf, and they were ungrateful, and at the same time, they did not obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when it was commanded for them to do. As a result of that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala subjected them to be lost in the desert for 40 years. This is the difference between tawheed and a lack of it. Tawheed gets you victory, and a lack of tawheed gets you failures. Until the entire generation in the 40 years that they were in the desert, all of them had to pass away, because it usually takes about 30 to 40 years for a generation to pass away. That whole generation that worshipped the calf, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made sure that they were replaced. They were replaced by children who were basically grown up with the tarbiyah of tawheed. Even in this, there's a lesson that tawheed must be at the center of our families and our tarbiyah within the family. That the parents have a responsibility to convey this tawheed to their children so that they can actually act upon it. And only then will they be given victory. This is the connection that we have between Ashura and Muharram, and even the topic that we're discussing within the context of the family. Now this is a very odd thing, by the way. A lot of people, when they go to a halaqah or a lecture which is talking about families and establishing righteous households, they don't really hear the message of tawheed. Aqeedah and tawheed are, generally speaking, not the primary topics. But I want to focus and emphasize on this the most, because this exactly ties to what the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam said we should be looking for in a potential spouse, even before we have children. Even at the time of establishing our family, when we're looking for a spouse, what do we look for? The Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he told the men, تُنْكَحُ الْمَرْأَةُ لِأَرْبَعٍ, that a woman is married for 4 qualities. لِمَالِهَا وَلِحَسَبِهَا وَلِجَمَالِهَا وَلِدِينِهَا فَاظْفَرْ بِذَاتِ الدِّينِ. That she's married for her wealth, she's married for her lineage, she's married for her beauty, and she's married for her deen. So choose the one who has the deen. What is this deen? This deen is the expression of tawheed. This deen is basically singling out Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in worship, in obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Similarly, when it comes to the women, the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, when he mentioned, إِذَا خَطَبَ إِلَيْكُم مَّن تَرْضَوْنَ دِينَهُ وَخُلُقَهُ فَزَوِّجُوهُ. That if a man comes to you proposing marriage and he has deen and akhlaq, then let them get married. This deen, the fundamental, the foundation of this deen is tawheed. If they're lacking in tawheed, it will basically come and bleed into other aspects of their life as well. As we mentioned. How so? Let's give an example of a very successful companion, both male and female. Who's heard of the companion named 𝗟𝗶𝗸𝗲? Has anybody here heard of the name of the companion 𝗟𝗶𝗸𝗲 radiallahu anhu? Raise your hand. You don't have to basically answer. Just raise your hand if you've heard. Okay, you've heard as well. Okay, you've heard. 𝗟𝗶𝗸𝗲 radiallahu anhu. SubhanAllah, we don't even know his last name. We don't even know the name of his father. Why? Because this was a companion who was very unattractive. He was physically very, very unattractive. To the point where, according to the narration in Musnad Imam Ahmad, it says that he used to basically go and take refuge among the women because he was mocked and he was basically just belittled in the circles of the men. So he would often basically seek refuge in the circles of the women. Eventually, when it came time for him to get married, obviously he was having a lot of trouble finding a spouse. So the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who loved this companion, he loved 𝗟𝗶𝗸𝗲 radiallahu anhu. He basically says to one of the Ansar companions who had a daughter, that I have a proposal for you. So initially the Ansari man thought that the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam is actually proposing marriage directly to his daughter. So then he was pleased. But then the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam says that it is not for me. It is actually on behalf of 𝗟𝗶𝗸𝗲. As soon as the man heard that this was actually a proposal on behalf of 𝗟𝗶𝗸𝗲, he immediately, obviously, was taken aback. So he said, I'm going to go back and discuss this with the mother of my daughter, his wife, and he will consult. So as soon as he goes home, he basically says to his wife that the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam sent a proposal. So she was very delighted as well in the beginning. But then he said, this is actually for 𝗟𝗶𝗸𝗲. Immediately, as soon as she hears it, what was her response? She's like, no, absolutely not. Absolutely not. She was basically quarreling with her husband, saying that we will never basically marry our daughter to 𝗟𝗶𝗸𝗲. But you had the daughter in the other room listening to this. She was listening to the discussion between the parents that was happening here. And she overheard the fact that there was a proposal that was there from 𝗟𝗶𝗸𝗲 by the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So she came and basically asked her mother, is that really so? She said, yes, that is so. Initially, the mother said to the daughter, no way. Look at the response of the daughter, the Ansari woman. Because she had heard the ayah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which she narrated to the mother, to the parents, both of them. وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ وَلَا مُؤْمِنَةٍ إِذَا قَضَى اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ أَمْرًا أَن يَكُونَ لَهُمُ الْخِيَرَةُ مِنْ أَمْرِهِمْ. That it is not befitting for a believer, male or female, that if a judgment, a command from Allah and His Messenger comes, that they have any say regarding it. This is Tawheed. She says this to the parents, and she says, if the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam said this, I will do it. They eventually get married, and then very soon after, the call of the Battle of Uhud was done, and 𝗟𝗶𝗸𝗲 radiallahu anhu went with the companions to fight, and he eventually was martyred there in the Battle of Uhud. And because the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam loved 𝗟𝗶𝗸𝗲 so much, he held his head while his grave was being dug, and he personally with his own hands buried 𝗟𝗶𝗸𝗲 radiallahu anhu. This is the example of how Tawheed basically comes in the form of obedience. Listen to the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam when he found out that this was the response of the daughter. He actually makes dua for her. He says, Ya Allah, pour abundant amount of blessings on her and don't make her life difficult. The Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he found out that this was the response, this was the Tawheed of this woman, he makes dua for her to have a easy life with no difficulty. In fact, the Sahaba used to say that this woman, who we don't even know the name of, subhanAllah, but we're narrating her legacy 1400 years afterwards. This woman was the most sought after widow in the whole of the city. When the companions were going back to Medina from the Battle of Uhud, some of the companions were actually rushing and they were racing. They were racing one another to see who's going to go to her house and propose marriage. Why? Because they understood that this woman has this quality of Tawheed. This is how you build a lineage, a legacy. Similarly, you have the likes of Umar bin Khattab. I'll narrate this story as well. This is a very beneficial story. One day, Umar bin Khattab in his Khilafah, when he was the leader, he used to go out in the night time and he would basically just go and see if anybody was in need of help. Anywhere, in the whole city. Imagine you have a leader, literally at nighttime, with his servant, he would go and see, is there anyone begging that he can basically give him provisions? Is there anybody in need that he can help? And so on and so forth. So one night, he spent all of these hours going around from one house to another, one street to another, until he wanted to rest a little bit. So he goes and he rests against the wall of a particular house. And behind the wall, there was a mother and a daughter. And they were basically taking and milking the sheep for milk. And once they had enough milk, they had a bucket of milk. The mother tells the daughter, why don't you go and add a little bit of water in it as well, so that we can make more money out of it. The woman says, didn't you hear that the 𝗪𝗁𝗵𝗿𝗲, 𝗪𝗵𝗿𝗲 is the one who forbade that? He made it illegal for us to add water to the milk. The mother says to the daughter, she says, yeah, Umar said this, but he's not here. The daughter's response was that yes, Umar is not here, but the Lord of Umar is here. Meaning, he knows. He's seeing everything. When Umar radiallahu anh, he basically heard all of this conversation from the other side when he was resting behind the wall. He immediately goes and he puts a little tag on this house. The next morning he goes to his sons and he tells them that this is the woman I want you to basically go and propose marriage to. So one of his sons who was not married at that time, his name is 𝗪𝗶 ibn Umar. He's the one who basically says, okay, him and Umar, both the father and the son, they go to that house and they inquire about the daughter, and eventually both of them, they agree upon the marriage and they get married. From his lineage comes who? Who knows? Who knows that fantastic figure who came from the direct lineage of these two individuals, 𝗪𝗶 and the woman, the righteous woman who had tawheed, who had taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Who knows the name of that individual? The daughter basically that came from that marriage was the mother of a very important figure in our history. Anybody know that name or no? That name is Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. Umar ibn Abdul Aziz is the mujaddid, he's the reviver of the first generation of the deen. According to some, he is considered to be one of the rightly guided khulafa, the fifth one. This giant came from the lineage of these two individuals. Look at how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protects the lineage and how He produces gems when two individuals who have an implementation of tawheed. Look what happens. This is the quality that we need to be looking for even prior to marriage. This is what we need to develop and cultivate in ourselves, and then eventually transfer that as well. Whereas on the other end, when you have individuals who commit sins, it impacts everything in our life. There's a very famous figure from among the Salaf. His name is Fudayl ibn Iyad. Has anybody heard of the name Fudayl ibn Iyad? Fudayl ibn Iyad is a tabi'i. So he was basically from the generation that came after the tabi'een. He died in the year 187 after Hijrah. And subhanAllah, these are individuals that we need to know their life so that we can benefit from them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made these individuals as a role model for us, the Salaf of this ummah. The first three generations, the best of generations. This was a man who in his jahiliyyah, in his pre-practicing days, was actually a highway robber. He used to steal. He used to steal and commit all kinds of lewd sins until Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guides him. And He guides him in such a way that he becomes one of the greatest imams of the first three generations. Fudayl ibn Iyad. He has a very important statement that I want each and every single one of us to understand and learn from. Where he says, إِنِّي لَأَعْصِيَ اللَّهِ فَأَعْرِفُ ذَلِكَ فِي خُلُقِ حِمَارِي وَخَادِمِي وَامْرَأَتِي. He says when reflecting upon his own actions, his own life, that any time he commits a sin, he commits a ma'asiyah, a sin, he says that I can recognize, I can see the impact of that in my donkey, in my riding beast. and in my servant at home, and in my wife. Basically in my family. He can see the impact of that. All of a sudden, after he commits a sin, he goes home and there's some kind of a rift. There's some kind of an argument that breaks out. Something just doesn't click anymore. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically is trying to teach him a lesson for what he did. This is the impact, this is the direct connection that we have between our sins and the real impact that we have in our families. SubhanAllah, we have individuals who are complaining, parents who are complaining about their children being astray. There are parents who are literally crying day and night. Why? Because their son is an alcoholic or a drug addict, or their daughter is basically committing this sin or that sin, or they're completely astray, or they can't get married, they have one difficulty after another, they have financial difficulties, they have social troubles, and so on and so forth. And when you look at their life, the life of the parents, you see that they're living in a mortgaged house. You see that they're farther away from the deen. And then they expect goodness to come out of their own progeny, their own legacy, their own lineage. How is that possible? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches a lesson in Surah Nuh. فَقُلْتُ اسْتَغْفِرُوا رَبَّكُمْ إِنَّهُ كَانَ غَفَّارًا يُرْسِلِ السَّمَاءَ عَلَيْكُمْ مِدْرَارًا وَيُمْدِدْكُمْ بِأَمْوَالٍ وَبَنِينَ وَيَجْعَلْ لَكُمْ أَنْهَارًا وَيَجْعَلْ لَكُمْ جَنَّاتٍ وَيَجْعَلْ لَكُمْ أَنْهَارًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says from the tongue of Nuh alayhi salam that he's complaining to Allah. I said to my people, seek forgiveness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَقُلْتُ اسْتَغْفِرُوا رَبَّكُمْ إِنَّهُ كَانَ غَفَّارًا. Indeed, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is forgiving. And if you do that, Allah will send you abundant rain. Look at the impact of istighfar. Allah will send you abundant rain. And not only that, Allah will increase you in your wealth and in your children. Meaning He will rectify your family so that you have a running lineage of righteous individuals after you. And He will basically send and bestow upon you gardens and rivers. All of this because of istighfar. Istighfar is what? What is istighfar?
Seeking forgiveness.
Seeking forgiveness. What does that actually mean though? Okay, so that's one saying astaghfirullah. Okay, what else does it mean? Correct. So recognizing your remorse. Beautiful. Does anybody else want to add to that? So the brother here said saying astaghfirullah, and then you said showing remorse, and then supplementing it with action. Is there anybody else who wants to add to that?
Repentance.
Repentance. Okay, what do you mean by that?
Asking forgiveness.
Okay, asking forgiveness. Anybody else wants to add to that? So istighfar, as the brother mentioned, completely is a form of transformation. It is transformation. It is going back away from the disobedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and transforming yourself so that you're in a state of obedience from then on forwards. If you're, for example, lazy, if you see laziness in your character and you intend to change that, you intend to basically go and work hard from now, naturally it's going to lead to what? Provisions. You can't be sitting at home and then expecting just the rain to just fall upon you and agriculture to just grow and businesses to just develop on its own. Similarly, if you're not basically developing yourself mentally and intellectually and spiritually, how can we basically have a healthy relationship with the opposite gender in our families, with our spouse? If we don't learn techniques and strategies of parenting, how can we basically transform our children and deal with the challenges that come with parenting in this day and age? All of this is istighfar. And all of this again ties to what we discussed before. So this is the first aspect as well, and the most important, which is even prior to marriage, we do our best to rectify the wrongs that we're doing, to strengthen our tawheed, because that is the ultimate source of victory, of success in our financial, in a financial sense, in a social sense, in a family sense, in an ummatic sense. as well, collectively and individually. All of it is tied to this quality of tawheed and of developing this crucial connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Everything in the Quran, our worship, our da'wah, our enjoining good and forbidding evil, everything is tied to this. And by the way, this quality of development is even more important and even more emphasized for the men. Why? Because the men are the ones leading their family. Part of leadership is to basically make sure that the individuals who are under our care are the ones who are basically being directed to that which is right. Differentiating right from wrong and guiding them is one of the most important aspects of a leader. And that's the position that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put a man in the context of a family. There's one of the Imams, Imam al-Sam'ani, he died, I believe, in the year 489. So fairly early, about over 1,000, or right a little bit under 1,000 years ago. He wrote a tafsir, and in his tafsir, in the ayah, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا قُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ وَأَهْلِيكُمْ نَارًا. O who you believe, protect yourselves and your families from the fire. In this ayah, he mentions a statement from one of the Salaf. His name was 𝗪𝗶𝗸𝗲 al-Mula'i. He's from one of the first three generations of the Ummah. He says regarding this ayah that a woman will actually stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the day of judgment, and one of the complaints that she will have from her husband is that my husband used to go to the market to fetch the provisions, to get the bread and the meat and so on and so forth, but he did not guide us when it comes to the deen. He did not teach us the right and the wrong from the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is going to be one of the complaints of a woman. For sure, enjoining good and forbidding evil and teaching one another is a responsibility of both sides. Everyone is involved in that. But there's an even greater emphasis on the men to at least learn and teach, or at the very least, even lesser than that, at least take them and facilitate for them knowledge. But for sure, the best is for you to learn yourself and then teach them as well. And similarly for the women, it will be to learn for the express purpose of teaching your children, and then to aid in guidance towards your husband as well. So that is the first aspect and the most important element. And that is, even before marriage, go on that path of development intellectually, mentally, spiritually, psychologically, and so on and so forth. Make a plan beforehand before it's too late. The second aspect is going to be to understand. So everything now is going to be related to this. The second aspect is to understand our responsibilities that will come with marriage. Because if we don't even understand the responsibilities that Allah expects from us, how can we possibly implement that which is just? Like we mentioned in the beginning, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from His sifat is the sifat of al-adl. He's the most just. Meaning the commands that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to the men, to the husband and to the wife, to the parents, to the children, is the most just. So we have to know exactly what that means. And in the theme of understanding or establishing families, I should say, we did an entire seminar, a 2-part seminar on the rights and responsibilities of the husband and the wife. Who basically attended that one? So you attended, anybody from the sisters who attended that? The rights of the husband and the wife? So we actually did a full detailed 2-part lecture which is on my YouTube channel as well. For those who didn't attend, highly suggest that you guys go and learn to the point where it becomes second nature. We have to know exactly what we have to do as a husband and as a wife. Again, to facilitate mercy. Part of the qualities of mercy and affection that we mentioned from the ayah in Surah Al-Rum is the fulfillment of our responsibilities. Because that ensures that our necessities and our needs that are fundamental to us are met. Whether it's the times of good or times of trials and tribulations and difficulties. So who remembers, by the way, from those who attended and even from those who didn't, what are some of the rights of the husband and the wife that we need to emphasize? So the mutual rights that we mentioned were good conduct, respect, maintaining a level of dignity, no matter what the situation is, even in times of anger, enjoining good and forbidding evil. These were 4 fundamental mutual rights and responsibilities of marriage that we mentioned. When it comes to the wife and the rights of the wife, we mentioned the first right was the financial rights, and that was split into 2. The first were the mahr, and then the second were the maintenance. And we went into a lot of details regarding what that actually means. What does it mean to maintain your wife financially? What is in her rights and what is beyond it? We discussed all of that. So I suggest if anybody wants to know and learn a little bit more about that, to go and access that particular lecture. The second right of the wife we mentioned was companionship. So spending the nights. For those who work in the day, this is part of the rights of the wife. And the last were, and this can also be grouped in the mutual rights, which is intimacy, conjugal rights. And then we mentioned the rights of the husband, which were, first and foremost, obedience. Obedience because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who's made him and put him in the position of a leader. And part of that leader-follower relationship is that we've obeyed the leader, and the leader basically enjoins the justice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon us. That bilateral relationship is existent in all institutions of life, and the family is no different. And then from other rights that we mentioned was serving the husband, basically doing the domestic chores and serving the husband. And the last was the protection of that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would protect, of things like honor, of his wealth in his absence. When he goes outside of the house, or when he's not there present in front of her, she needs to be protecting his honor in front of others, and his wealth, and so on and so forth, his property, his home, his children, and so on and so forth. So this is the second aspect. We have to know and we have to live by these responsibilities. We have to. It needs to be second nature to us. The third aspect, which is also very, very important in this day and age, is that we need to adopt role models that shape our practical understanding of a healthy marriage. And ideally and preferably, those role models need to be in person. It is very, very common today, unfortunately, to the detriment of the family unit, that you have the average Muslim man and an average Muslim woman, especially when they're in their youth. Where is the first source, or what is the first source of their guidance when it comes to marriage? What do you guys think?
Parents.
Is it really parents?
Should be.
We're not talking about it should be, we're talking about what is it actually.
And what I'm saying is you can exclude.
Okay, so that's one way to look at it, and that is certainly the case with many families where you have kids who are basically exposed to their parents, and how their parents they're going to naturally replicate some of those tendencies, even if they're doing it subconsciously, because of, again, the vicinity and the closeness. What else? What is another source of the modern day guide for marriage? Correct. This is actually the most dangerous source of guidance, quote unquote guidance, that we're getting. Where we have people who are not vetted to be counselors, to be guides for the community, but purely by virtue of their following on social media, for whatever reason they have amassed a massive following, they're basically being looked at for guidance on what to do and what not to do based on 30-second clips on TikTok and Instagram and so on and so forth. This is one of the biggest disasters that we're facing today. That you have individuals who would never pick up a book on how to become a righteous spouse, but they would go and engage themselves in the drama on social media in order to basically extract an understanding and then project it in real life. This is something that we need to fundamentally get away from, especially this gossip culture that is spreading misinformation. Imagine you have for years and years and years somebody who's following an influencer who, for example, for one reason or another, their marriage didn't work out. And now they've made it a life mission to basically disparage the opposite gender and disparage the concept of marriage and give them as much misinformation as possible. There are many youth today, unfortunately, they have a fundamental fear of marriage. Why? Because they've been exposed to all negativity. And especially when we look at the algorithms on social media that favors negativity over positivity. You're not going to find positive examples as much as you will find the drama and the negative examples. So the suggestion is very simple. Do not make them your source of guidance. Have in-person individuals who are trustworthy in the community, who have knowledge both in the deen and they have a level of wisdom that other people can testify to in real life. Because not everybody who has knowledge of the deen actually has wisdom when it comes to practical interactions. And vice versa. You may have certain elements of practical interactions that you get right. But then there's always going to be some level of ignorance in objective standards that you need to basically go back to. So in person, trustworthy individuals who have a track record that other people can testify to. Find that individual. Especially those who have demonstrated a healthy marriage. Even in person, by the way, you might fall into the pitfall of an individual who, let's say, has been through a recent divorce. And because of that, their subjective inclination is to disparage marriage. You don't want to surround yourself with those individuals who are giving you unhealthy understanding of marriage. Somebody who comes from a good, healthy family that developed a healthy mindset of the interaction between a husband and a wife and between parents and children. That's the person that you want to replicate and seek advice from. And when you find that individual, make sure that you maintain a level of privacy and confidentiality. We should not be the ones airing our dirty laundry outside. This has a terrible consequence, by the way. Because at times what happens is you have problems in your family, everybody starts to know about it, and the next, let's say if the couple or if a family basically goes and seeks help and rectifies, well then everybody else who was exposed to the negativity, they're not going to be exposed to the rectification and the reconciliation usually. The negativity stays in the community. And that's what you want to avoid. And you have to have, look at, there's an example that comes to mind. One time Ali and Fatima, radiallahu anhuma, they had basically an argument. And Ali radiallahu anh basically goes to the masjid and he sleeps there for the night. And he sleeps on the floor. When the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam, the father and the father-in-law, in this case, and obviously as a guide of the ummah, as the father figure of the ummah, when he finds out about this, what does he do? He goes to the masjid, he picks up Ali radiallahu anh, and he dusts him off. Because obviously at that time the masjid was not paved. So literally he had, Ali radiallahu anh, he had basically dust on his clothes. He picks him up, he dusts him off, and he gives him a nice laqab as well, a kunya, Abu Turab. Basically the father of dust, just as a nice light-hearted title. And he literally holds his hand and he takes him to the house of Fatima, basically where they were staying. And in one hand he has the hand of Fatima radiallahu anha, and in the other hand he has the hand of Ali. And he's basically reconciling between them and bringing their hearts together. This is the benefit of having an in-person guide who's trustworthy, who's knowledgeable in your life. That's how we basically rectify problems in our families. Not by posting an anonymous post on Reddit, which is very, very common these days. And then you have a bunch of 16-year-olds, 20-year-olds, single individuals, unknown individuals in tens or even hundreds commenting, oh, divorce, 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 divorce. People are laughing here, but this is the reality. There are actually families breaking because of this. This is what we're trying to avoid. The fourth aspect is adopting the right channels for searching as well. One of the biggest challenges that we have today is that the channels being adopted by the youth in even searching for a spouse are problematic. The first thing they do is basically they go on apps where let's say you have an app, a famous app that has 1,000 profiles, and immediately they have an abundance mindset, where they now start to think that, oh, okay, this individual I have a little bit in common with, but what about the next person? Let's try and see what about the next person, and then the next person, and then the next person. And the search continues for years and years. And all of it is done behind the backs of their own families. This is an absolute disaster. Do not approach marriage like this. You want to build, like we mentioned in the first aspect, build a foundation of righteousness. When we gave the example of Asim, and the woman who basically told her mother not to mix the water and the milk together. How did they approach marriage here? You had an honorable solution. Umar radiallahu anh, the father, he takes his son and he goes to the family, and both of them look at one another, and both of them realize that obviously they have very much in similarity, and they like one another. Khalas, that's it. Get it married. Nothing was happening behind the backs of the parents. Nothing was happening without the consent of the wali. Nothing was happening for years and years in a dating culture that we have in our ummah today. All of that is leading to nothing but rotten results. Where you have individuals, for example, who have been talking to one another for 3 years. And then this is all behind the backs, without the knowledge of the parents. And then once after 3 years, the parents find out about it, they want to introduce each other. The parents reject the other side. So what do you do in that situation? You just wasted 3 years of your life. This is the recipe for absolute disaster when it comes to establishing marriages. Stand upon the foundation of taqwa, and only then you'll see the real manifestation of affection and mercy. Always go back to the ayah that we mentioned in the beginning. وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً. Allah is the one taking responsibility for instilling affection and mercy. It's not going to come to us if we go about it in a manner of sin and transgression. Don't ever think that there's going to be true love and true affection between a husband and a wife if it came about with a sin. Even if there is inclination, it's going to be lust. It's not going to be love. It's not going to be long-lasting, true love that transcends even this dunya. Keep in mind that the Muslim does not marry only for this dunya. Our intention with marriage, when we say longevity, is not just for the temporary aspect of this dunya until we pass away. Rather, we should expect and we should long to be companions in the next life. How's that going to happen until and unless we exhibit a level of consistency, a level of piety, a level of true tawheed that we mentioned in the first step? All of that is absolutely essential. And then when it comes to, we'll basically finish with this one as the last aspect, and that is asking the right questions in order to shape the long-term vision of a family that we have. One of the issues that we mentioned in the beginning when it comes to modern day families is that we have a fundamental lack of a long-term focus. We're very short-sighted. We just want to get married for the sake of marriage. Why? Because so-and-so's son is now 25 years old, so-and-so daughter is now 24, 25 years old, we need to get them married. But what's going to happen afterwards? What's going to happen after 6 months and the honeymoon phase basically dies down and people start reverting back to their natural tendencies which they didn't bother improving and correcting beforehand? What's going to happen then? What's going to happen when there are conflicts and there's a fundamental lack of ability to handle those conflicts and reconcile? What's going to happen when there's a fundamental laziness to improve and progress our own weaknesses when we realize them? There are plenty of times we don't even know what our weaknesses are until and unless we're put in the situation where in front of a spouse that we basically differ with on a particular matter. Then we realize what our true weaknesses are. But if there's a fundamental aversion to improvement, how are we going to basically go about having a long-term vision. So asking the right questions, especially when it comes to the courting phase, and this is where the involvement of the parents is absolutely essential. Parents need to be involved in guiding their children to be examples for them. Because you lasted for 15, 20, 25 years of marriage. Teach them now in an effective, practical manner, how do you basically replicate and even improve upon this? What are the questions to ask? Instead of worrying about places to go on vacation and which restaurant you want to go to and all of these secondary, tertiary aspects, which will come, no doubt. There is an element of enjoyment in marriage. But there are fundamental qualities that we need alignment on, that we need to basically develop. And in here, basically, one of the biggest recommendations that I personally give, and many of our teachers have given, is when it comes to figuring out compatibility, especially in the courting phase. A lot of times we are very vague with the qualities that we seek. Or we have a long laundry list of 50 different qualities. And then we wonder why it's taking too long for us to find somebody who matches and who's compatible with us. Rather, what we need to basically do is, and one of the best recommendations that we can give is to come up with 3 deal breakers. Put a number to it. 3. Not 2, not 4, not 5. 3. 3 qualities that are absolute deal breakers. And they have to be specific. And because it's a limited number, it forces us to basically go and think. It forces us to practice what we really value and what we really want to seek. It basically gets the mind to exercise a level of discipline to figure out, okay, we have a task at hand, how do we go about it? What is most important to me, and what is something that we can basically work on as a secondary thing. So 3 deal breakers that are absolutely essential, that are not vague, that are specific. And then the rest, it could be 3 or 4 qualities that are good to haves, and then after that, everything is basically open. Open for development, open for learning, open for exploring among one another. So these are some recommendations that we can give in order to facilitate a family and in order to have a companionship that is long-lasting. Not just in this dunya, but also it extends to the akhirah, to paradise, inshallah. Are there any questions or any points or any discussion that needs to be done? No doubt. I don't think we dissected it from a scientific perspective here. We're basically giving fundamental qualities that have a direct correlation between, or direct correlation with a healthy marriage. And even the examples that you're giving with regards to the Sahaba, where there was a high divorce rate among the Sahaba, that wasn't the intent of the Sahaba. Of course. But that's what we're trying to maximize. Of course, we're not saying that we're ever going to be in a state where there's going to be 0 divorce. Divorce can actually be a source of mercy as well. Especially if you're in a situation where you're fundamentally incompatible. You did your best, but then it didn't work out. Then it can be a very important element to ensure health within the community. This is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made permissible in these kind of situations. So no doubt, but we're still asking and calling for the members of the community to do their absolute best to prevent that. And that is absolutely essential to have a healthy environment for children, right? Especially at the end of the day, and even before the children, subhanAllah, it's such an important element for the mental and the physical health of the individuals themselves, the man and the woman. We cannot basically discount that element either. All of that is there when there's sakina in the home. Of course. I mean, we're not detracting or discouraging marriage just because there's a possibility of divorce. Nobody would basically go on any endeavor if all they basically focus on is the possibility of failure in that particular path. There is a level of trust that you have to put in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And again, this is exactly what we're emphasizing. We mentioned the first quality as development of tawheed. A part of tawheed is tawakkul in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Making sure that we understand Allah is the one who provides for us. Allah is the one who basically has decreed this spouse as a form of provision for us. No doubt, no doubt. And there should never be a form of fear that prevents us from marriage. And the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he encouraged us to have children, and he commanded the shabab to be within the bond of marriage, to protect their private parts, to protect their families, their lineages, to have even a level of health from their own perspective as well. One of the greatest elements of our own protection and our own assurance of health in every aspect is companionship, right? A single life is not a natural life, fundamentally. So in terms of financial provisions within marriage. So I suggest you go back to that particular lecture on the rights and responsibilities of the husband and the wife. That basically goes in full details on what that actually means and so on and so forth. But in short, yes, it is very well known that it is the responsibility of the man to provide in terms of the basic maintenance, so that shelter, housing, and so on and so forth, for the wife and for the kids. So this is all as a responsibility upon him. It is still recommended, and she gets ajr for spending her own money as well within the home, but she's not obligated to do so. But that is to the extent of basically meeting the necessities and the overall needs of the family. It doesn't mean that a 6-bedroom house is obligatory on the man. So basically based on what is considered to be bil ma'ruf, what is reasonable, is what is upon the man. Any other questions from the sisters? Okay, so the question that the brother asked is very important, and that is, how do you overcome the challenge if, let's say, a person is placed in a home where the parents are not setting the right example? Even if they're saying the right things, but they're not conveying it in the most wise manner, or rather in a quote-unquote toxic manner. How do you basically go about doing it? No doubt that we will basically face different kind of trials and tribulations as Muslims. And this is no doubt one of the forms of trials. If a person is basically in a space, in a home, where the ones who are responsible for setting the right example are not the ones doing that, for one reason or another. Okay? I mean, we can basically address the parents' conduct in a separate session, which we'll basically touch a little bit more about in 2 weeks, when we have the second part. But what about us? What about our responsibility? The answer to that question is, we also have a brain of our own. We also have faculties within us as well. That even if we're dealt a bad hand, we have the ability to basically utilize the resources that are abundantly available today. And that's why we said, look for the examples in your practical real life. Look for role models, search for them. This is actually a task, it's an exercise. You have to surround yourself with at least one individual who you look up to for guidance and for answers to questions. Those who are in person, those who are trustworthy, those who have knowledge of deen, as well as they have wisdom in practical interactions. We mentioned all of this. This is an exercise. If you don't have a person like that in your life, then one, you need to be making a lot of dua for that individual, and search in the masajid, ask around individuals that they have sought assistance from. And once you find that individual, hold them close. Be close to those individuals, because they will guide. But you need to find in that kind of a situation, especially if you're dealt a bad hand at home, you need to find a mentor, a good, righteous mentor outside of the home. Okay, so this is absolutely essential. This is essential for the men and for the women. Yes. Okay, beautiful. So the brother mentioned as a follow-up that one of the challenges that we're facing right now is that there's a materialistic nature to marriages, and the approach to marriage is basically just about acquisition of resources and making sure that we have university degrees and we have a 4-bedroom house and a couple of cars before we actually get married and tie the knot, thinking that this is going to last or result in a lasting marriage. My question to you, to answer that, let me ask you a question. Why do you think I mention and emphasize Tawheed of Allah as the foundational quality in this lecture? It wouldn't matter as much. Okay, what do you think? Okay, same thing you said. Okay, yes. Okay, that's very true as well. We naturally attract our likes, right? If you're a righteous, pious individual, naturally you're going to basically look for other other righteous and pious individuals. Okay, anything else? But to emphasize the Tawheed aspect, the reason why I mentioned Tawheed being fundamental to the process of establishing families is because it aligns our standards with the standards of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The standards of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we mentioned when it comes to marriage and when you're ready for establishing a family was what? We mentioned that there's a balance where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is commanding the community to facilitate marriage for those who are single, based on the ayah in Surah An-Nur. But at the same time, you have to have a level of readiness, a level of preparation for marriage so that you're able to take care of the responsibilities that you'll be obligated to do. And for the man, no doubt, a materialistic element is there. So the responsibility now here comes. It's not just the act of getting two people married. It means that especially for the parents and the community at large, we have to put mechanisms in place such that a person as young as possible are ready and they are equipped with the tools necessary to get married. Meaning that it is one of the most fundamental responsibilities of the parents, especially when it comes to their sons, to instill responsibility of a financial nature as early as possible. And then for the women, based on their responsibilities in marriage, to instill a level of responsibility and give them tasks to prepare them as well. We can't just expect them that by the age of 24 and 25, now it's time for marriage, khalas, get married. No, that's going to be a disaster. You have to facilitate the prep as well. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands, وَأَنْكِحُ الْأَيَامَ مِنْكُمْ, marry the ones who are basically single from among you. That's not just a command of marriage. That's a command of everything that requires marriage as well, the prerequisites. Facilitate that as well at a community level. So for example, if you have a son, you know that by the age of 18 and 19 that son is going to be exposed to a lot of potential sins. Then the parent needs to have a much greater head start. Maybe at age like 7 or 8, start giving them little responsibilities of a financial nature, and then build on top of that. Get them used to working, let's say at age 15 and 16 in small menial jobs so that they have a little bit of income coming in and they have the ability to now budget. Teach them how to budget, for example. Teach them how to manage the little resources that are coming. Push them in fields which will give them enough provision by the time they're 18, 19, 20. Rather than, let's say, 30 or 35. After which they're basically put themselves at risk of committing a lot of sins. So in that kind of a situation, so the brother mentioned a very specific example of his friend, where right after graduating, so I'm assuming 1920 or 2021, they got married, or he got married to another woman, and they did not live with one another for a year or two until basically he was financially capable of standing up on his 2 feet. What is the recommendation on that? This is perfectly a viable solution. If, let's say, both sides agree, especially if it's a young couple, if, let's say, the parents have to facilitate their marriage, or if they basically are in the bond of nikah but they're living separately for a temporary period of time, or if they're living with the parents in a joint family temporarily just so that they're able to stand on their 2 feet, while at the same time they're working hard and they're doing their best to establish themselves so that eventually they can have their own place and they can raise a family. No problem in that. This is one of the best ways in this day and age to facilitate marriage. This is way better than the alternative of potentially committing zina, which is a very stark reality today. So no doubt, if, let's say, you have a couple of families who are able and they're willing to do that, willing to facilitate this, then alhamdulillah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless their marriage. Like I said, it is way better to protect yourself from zina than to, for example, live separately for a year. But you're still within the bond of marriage, no doubt. But this is one example of how we can basically go and facilitate this. It's not for everyone, and it cannot be extended to every single situation or every single family or every single person, but this is one possible solution, yes. That's the intent.
That was my whole point.
How do you convince your parents to get you guys married early before you have financial provisions, before you're ready for it? So this is basically a two-part solution. On the one part, we have to give a level of urgency to the parents to emphasize that, okay, look at the reality around you. And it is very likely that your own child, by the way, no parent thinks that it's their child, unfortunately, but it is a very likely reality. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect each and every single one of us and our children from zina and from any kind of haram. But it is a real possibility to basically continue for years and years in this kind of an environment. So the parents have to be reminded that yes, you must facilitate marriage as early as possible. And there's some seriously scary statements among the ulama as well. Like Ibn al-Jawzi rahimahullah, who said that if a son who's past the age of 15, and 15 basically represents the latest age of puberty. He's basically saying that if a child is in a state of post-pubescent, he's a teen or whatever, a youth, and he commits zina, a portion of the sin will go to the parents if they didn't do their best to facilitate marriage. Meaning there is a level of investment and responsibility that a parent has. We see even 𝗪𝗁𝗵𝗿𝗲, 𝗪𝗵𝗿𝗲, actively, encouraging his sons to get married and to righteous individuals. But on the other end, we have the second element as well, where the youth man, the youth woman, needs to show their parents a level of responsibility too. That you can't be the one playing video games for 8 hours after school or after university, and you have zero experience in the workforce. You have zero experience gaining enough skills to be able to take care of your financial responsibilities. Or you have zero skills as a woman to take care of your responsibilities in the future. And you're showing your own parents a lack of responsibility, a lack of seriousness, and childish behavior, which is very common among even those who are in their mid-20s, in their late 20s, subhanAllah. You can't have that and still, get your parents to facilitate marriage. Like I would highly advise a parent not to get their child married if they're showing a level of immaturity. Because what's going to happen when you put them in the same room as their spouse? And they're fundamentally ill-equipped to handle the responsibilities of marriage. What's going to come out of it? Other than chaos. So this is a two-part solution. Yes, the parents have to be reminded of their responsibility and the emphasis on facilitating marriage, but at the same time, we have to do our part and we have to basically give them and show them what the plan is. What is your plan to basically take care of your spouse? Does that answer your question? Okay, yes. Or before that, are there any other questions from the sisters? Okay, she raised her hand first. Yes. Okay, beautiful. This is actually, Jazakallah khair for bringing up that topic. I was actually having a discussion with somebody on this exact same issue in a different family. One thing we need to understand, and that's why I emphasized the statement of Fudayl ibn Iyad. Do you remember the statement that I mentioned? Where he said that whenever I sinned, I was able to observe the impact of that on my riding beast, on my servant, and on my wife, and in my home. Meaning that some things were just not going their way. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was basically giving them the impact of their sin in this dunya before the next. Okay, and this is a source of mercy as well. It forces us to kind of reconcile and really think on how to fix the situation. So this is the reason why I mentioned it, because our sins have a direct impact on what happens in our life. If you want facilitation, and that's why I also mentioned the example of 𝗟𝗶𝗸𝗲 and the woman who married him. Because the Rasul ﷺ specifically made a dua for her, وَلَا تَجْعَلْ عَيْشَهَا كَدًّا. Oh Allah, do not make her life difficult. Because of her tawheed and because of her reliance on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the fact that she was willing to readily submit to the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his command, to have her matters facilitated for her. So this is where, if your parents are not privy to this, then you need to remind them of this, that a mortgage is a major sin. Engaging in riba is waging or declaring a war upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you're expecting goodness to come out of that kind of a situation, then you haven't understood deen yet fully. Which is fine, but you need to basically rectify as much as possible and advise them in the best of ways. Okay? So to get out of that as fast as possible, as soon as possible, and paying it off quickly is not a solution. Because tomorrow, who can guarantee life until tomorrow? No, we have to basically go and immediately when we understand something is wrong, let it go. A lot of people, when they have weakness in Tawheed, they fear certain things like poverty. They fear a lack of provisions. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says this in the Quran. الشيطان يعدكم الفقر ويأمركم بالفحشاء. Listen to this. Allah is saying shaitan makes you fear poverty. And he commands you to do things that are immoral. Whereas Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he continues and he says that Allah is promising you forgiveness and a great bounty of paradise. So if somebody has to, for example, give up something haram for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as the Messenger says sallallahu alaihi wasallam, anybody who gives up something for Allah's sake, Allah will replace it with something better. But this is how you basically need to kind of frame it with your parents to remind them of the impact that sins have in our life. This could be a major factor that basically prevents a lot of goodness to come in your home. This is a very, very likely scenario. And I know tons and tons of other families who are in that kind of a situation. The more you rectify, that's why I also mentioned the ayah in Surah Nuh. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, the ones who do istighfar, فَقُلْتُ اسْتَغْفِرُوا رَبَّكُمْ إِنَّهُ كَانَ غَفَّارًا. Where Nuh is telling his people, I said to them to make istighfar because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is forgiving. Why? One of the benefits was وَيُمْدِدُكُمْ بِأَمْوَالٍ وَبَنِينَ, because Allah will basically aid you or increase you in wealth and in children. The increase in children comes with families. It comes in facilitation of marriage. Right? So all of this, why? Because there's rectification of actions. And if they have a mortgaged house, this is a big source of challenges and difficulties. Get rid of it ASAP. And if you have to rent in the temporary period, so what? And as far as contributing is concerned towards the mortgage, if they're asking you for payments or if they need financial help and you want to help them, you're more than welcome to give them, or rather recommended to give them money with the intention of just helping them. It doesn't have to be like, oh, I intend to pay your mortgage. Do you understand the difference? So don't aid in paying their mortgage with that intent. Don't aid and abet in a major sin. But if you want to contribute, you can contribute with a different intent to help them out for the sake of Allah. Does that answer your question? So the law of land is one, and the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is something else. One supersedes the other. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he said, لا طاعة لمخلوق بمعصية الخالق. There's no obedience to the creation and the disobedience to the Creator. If you have to basically live in a mortgaged house, first of all, don't do that. It's a major sin. There are only a few, very, very few exceptions in which a mortgage will be made permissible as an exception. In situations of, let's say, life and death, where haram becomes halal to a very certain extent. The vast majority of people don't meet that exceptional requirement or conditions. So if you have to basically go and live on rent, then do so. If you can't afford it, go to a different place. Allah's earth is vast. If you think that you have to basically go and commit a major sin just because you want to live in that one specific place, no. That's not an exception that you're going to be granted. Allah's earth is vast. If you can't afford here, go somewhere else where you can afford it. At the end of the day, we're living for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is only a trial testing period. We're not here basically to establish a 4-wall, 2,000 square foot house. If it comes at the expense of disobeying and displeasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No. So, yes, Muslims should have houses. But if you're living in a situation where it's tough and there are available alternatives, then you must avail the alternatives in the interim. And then basically have more long-term solutions that come at a communal level later on. And this is a different discussion on how to improve the situation collectively. طيب, any other questions from the brother side? Yes. Okay. So, no, I think you raised his hand before that. I'll come back. Oh, you raised your hand. Okay, I want to be fair. Okay, Abdurrahman, go. He uses taqwa a lot because of accountability. How are you going to have mercy without justice? How are you going to have justice without us implementing and applying taqwa, which is obeying the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? This whole system exists in a cohesive manner. Everything is interconnected. Taqwa basically leads to justice, and justice leads to mercy. And mercy is absolutely essential for any relationship to last, especially when it's time when there are difficult times. Oh, of course. Of course. Taqwa is mentioned, if I remember correctly, in its multiple forms over 200 times. The reason why is because of how important it is and how much reminder the human being needs. How easy it is when we have anything of difficulty or of power or of affluence or any kind of situation that basically opens the doors to transgressions. That's why taqwa is mentioned again and again and again and again. There's specific actions like fasting and like praying that are designed to increase taqwa as well. That comes recurring again and again and again. All of it in order to remind the human being, because this is absolutely essential to any kind of longevity and effectiveness in society. Does that answer your question? Of course, yes. That's why I mentioned again mercy. وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً. How's the rahmah going to come? It comes through application of taqwa. There's no rahmah without taqwa. Because that element of justice and element of fulfillment of responsibilities that are absolutely essential for a healthy marriage are absent. So taqwa very much so is tied to a successful family. But I wanted to focus a little bit more on tawheed, because that is even more general, even more encompassing than taqwa itself. Taqwa is the result of tawheed. Just like tawakkul is the result of tawheed. Sabr is the result of tawheed. And so on and so forth. That's why I wanted to address the foundations first, and then everything else comes afterwards. Any other questions? Okay. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك وجزاكم الله خيرا. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.